Hello, this is Sergio Marrero, and we are here at RBL1 Live with Helen Adeosun. She is CEO of CareAcademy, which is a platform delivering online training related to the medical profession for medical professionals and caregivers. So, thank you for joining us today, Helen.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Sergio.
And to share a little bit more of Helen's background, she was a TFA core member and a teacher in the Greater Atlanta region. She went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I was also a founder with her a long time ago as a Mass Challenge finalist. Working out of Boston, and she remains in Boston leading her business. And also just wanted to say, sharing great news with the audience, that she just closed her Series A, 9.5 million raised in leading the growth of CareAcademy. So again, congrats on that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
But for the audience, can you share a little bit more about what is CareAcademy?
Yeah, so CareAcademy, I mean, just even in the wake of COVID, is coming at a very interesting time, but it's also for a world that I imagined, several years before what we're going through right now. We are starting to see within healthcare just a greater focus on how we can provide care where people are. And typically, and sometimes, it's not going to be within the four walls of a hospital, especially when we're looking at what's currently happening. People as customers of healthcare don't necessarily feel safe going into a hospital, especially given the current situation. And so what essentially is happening, it's an exacerbation of people looking for other ways to receive healthcare, and we have to empower the people to be able to do that. Currently, there's a national shortage of healthcare workers, specifically direct care workers and home care workers. And so we are the first platform bringing the ability to scale the healthcare workforce. So we do that with online training. We're doing that also through interoperability and other opportunities to expand the workforce to be able to care for older adults and a number of different constituencies within the home care setting. So I'm very excited to talk about the work we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about there being can you talk about where CareAcademy fits in the ecosystem and in the process in increasing the number of medical professionals?
That's a great question. It's a human enablement, right, platform. It's human enablement and then also measuring outcomes of that human enablement. A lot of healthcare to date really focuses on technology, right? And so when you think about healthcare technology, it is, something that may be creating a way for you to access a doctor. But more and more, we're finding that we need to distribute the means of getting healthcare, and that actually starts with people. So it's people learning how to use different technologies. It's people learning how to use best practices and disseminate best practices. And quite often, we barely do that for our clinicians, right? And so there's a wonderful and an illuminating survey actually that came out a couple of years ago that the majority of surgeons in the U.S. Access YouTube videos, right, in order to get best practices. So if you think about a world where surgeons, right, the sort of the most specialized and the most trained of clinicians are using YouTube videos, what is everyone else left with? I have been a direct care worker myself. I was also using YouTube videos and Facebook to really kind of get best practices. And so CareAcademy stemmed from a belief that we could do this a lot better, that we could be much more intentional about how do you optimize the human and optimize a healthcare worker to be able to do the job in the field, on the go, and provide access for that, and then really scale and skill that person over time. So we talk a lot, and I'll drop this word quite a bit, upskilling. The idea that, we're in a labor economy where you can't just do one job and do that forever. And there's a lot more expected of all of us, as we are in the workforce. So CareAcademy is really built as a platform to make sure that people are not learning just sort of one rote skill, but they're learning skills over time, because that's what healthcare healthcare has to do, right? In the midst of COVID right now, one of the challenges has been teaching people about the disease and then also how to help people with the disease. A lot of the employers who utilize our platform were struggling with ways to do that, especially knowing that they couldn't bring employees and direct care workers into the office. So in real time, you know, as the WHO was announcing that COVID-19 was a pandemic, we were building supports and within our technology to enable the workforce to learn about COVID, learn in real time what the WHO is saying, and then we were updating that on a weekly basis. That's the kind of reaction that's going to be needed, I think, going forward. Our platform is essentially enabling that.
That's great. It especially, I love that. It's in line with, I like to use the phrase from the CEO of LinkedIn Learning, says that education has been a system of just in case learning. You learn all these things just in case you may use them, where we need systems of just in time learning. And I think that's what you are delivering in this specific healthcare profession. Can you share, I know this it talks more about healthcare in general. It's so expensive and extensive to become a doctor, and rightfully so. You're dealing with people's lives. But what are some things that you see or that you believe needs to happen in order to kind of like just reduce the cost of care and get more people practicing medical professionals like into the field, you know, at large?
That's a really beautifully framed question, and I think it's what I'm proud of is that CareAcademy envisions a paradigm shift that it is also part of enacting, right? I'll just speak to a couple tenets, and first and foremost, we say that CareAcademy is an education intervention that builds lives in order to save lives, right? It's both working in tandem; they're perfectly aligned. We also know this, and you know, I'm happy to speak about this, but I won't elaborate too much. But people's lives are not sort of in silos, right? CareAcademy is more than a double impact company; it's multiple impacts. So the first and foremost thing is that we need to distribute healthcare education. So how do we ensure that community health workers, direct care workers, and people themselves, right, know how to care for themselves? There's a new thing, and I'll always try to expand on my definitions here, but the value-based healthcare system. The U.S. has always been a fee-for-service system. So I go in, I get something done, or I see my doctor and I pay for that. We are entering into a new normal before COVID, whereby individuals and the system are looking for the most cost-effective means and are being rewarded. The system is being rewarded for saving money and saving lives, right? So, and that starts with people. So by educating the folks who are a part of the healthcare system but unrecognized, so you have doctors and nurses who people think of as healthcare professionals, we're actually expanding the definition at CareAcademy. We're saying that it's not just the doctors and nurses, but the caregiver who sees your grandparent every single day. They are just as critical in terms of healthcare intervention. And so let's expand let's start having this person live at the margins of understanding what they need to do. Can we help treat chronic diseases by making sure the people who are having day-to-day contact or feeding your grandparent who may have a heart condition, low sodium foods, right, so that she can avoid readmissions? By doing this and by empowering this individual to know more, can we empower also your grandparent? Can we think more expansively about where education comes in as far as being a healthcare intervention and thus preventing readmissions, right? Readmissions to hospitals account for some of the most expensive parts of our healthcare ecosystem, especially when we talk about the vulnerability of older adults. And so we posit that education is the cheapest form of healthcare intervention, right? But you have to get it right. Health education as a healthcare intervention is not a sheet of paper. And right now, I don't know about you, Sergio. The last time I went in for surgery, the discharge nurse handed me a sheet of paper and said, here, right, you've been informed, and had me walk out. That's not going to cut it. It shouldn't cut it, because we have the best practices of informing adult learners. So we're utilizing that as part of our platform. We have a 90% completion rate. So people are not just getting the information, they're actually taking it in and they're utilizing it. And most importantly, you've got to measure that outcome, right? Because the proof is in the pudding. So for us, we're the first company ever to say that we're completely reimagining just talking about training from a healthcare perspective. We're actually measuring the efficacy of those outcomes, both for the learner as well as for the patient. And so we're looking for partners in doing that, to be able to look at the whole life cycle of the individual receiving care as well as the person giving care, because we believe that we can create a more effective system, a system that has accessibility of care for everyone, and a system that ultimately empowers direct care workers as healthcare workers, as essential workers, and as professionals.
No, that's great. I mean, definitely see this as what you've built and continue to build as infrastructure, right? As more medical services go virtual, there's administration. And by administering, I mean people giving themselves medicine, injections, and what have you, and they almost need to become in part a medical professional, you know, and you're enabling them to do that. So that's you know, that's powerful. So I want to shift over and talk more about you. How did Helen end up starting CareAcademy? I know it's been in a long journey, you know, 7+ years.
Journey. It's a long journey, by the way. People say that, and I always ask, like, relative to what, though, right? I think foundership is a long journey, right? And the myth is the overnight success, and the best companies that we love and hold dear in the mythology of these companies, it took a while to build, right? Or the ideas took a while to get to market and really become what they are today. So it's been a journey, and I'm here for the journey.
No, I love it. I think that I talked to a number of founders that, or aspiring founders, that they're like, oh, I'm going to just do a startup and then I'm going to go do this other thing. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, that's like when you do a startup, it's longer than most careers.
It is.
If you
That's
stick,
right.
Yeah, if you stick to it, it's like what average is like 2 to 3 year window in a company if you work at a company, and then startup founder, it's like 10+ years, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's exactly it.
So, but yeah, if you can share a little bit about how did you go from, you know, I know you were in Teach for America. You were previously a teacher in Atlanta. Even before that, you know, advocacy in refugees and immigrants at the U.S. Committee, all the way back. How did you end up saying, I'm going to start my own company and we're going to do this? So especially in the medical field, like if you could share a little bit.
So, you know, it's always so funny, because if you open up my story a little bit more, all of the points build up to this line. And so it's maybe a snowball effect of everything in my life has led up to this point. But I always say I was a very reluctant founder, right? I am passionate, and to some of the things that you mentioned, Sergio, thanks for doing your research, about immigration issues, about workforce, about education. So by way of background, and maybe just to weave a thread through those points, my parents immigrated from Nigeria, specifically to study healthcare. And so a pretty wide swath of clinicians, nurses, doctors come from West Africa. And my parents and my family members are no exception to that. I'm actually a little bit of a black sheep by virtue of going into education. But I started to kind of weave the thread, or maybe the snowball is probably a better analogy of what became CareAcademy. While I was teaching, I taught high school, specifically because while I was in college, I noted that those last 4 years of education, right, within the public school system, made such a huge impact in terms of my trajectory. And I think sometimes we underestimate that. We focus a lot on primary education and don't think about sort of what the longitude is of secondary education and how grade point averages are impacted, and sort of, what are the trajectories we set in terms of expectations of college, and career readiness. And we do a lot of short shrift within this country. And so while I was in grad school at the iLab, a lot of my time was spent researching how other countries had put into motion workforce and career readiness in a way that this country had not. And so as policy, and I was just intrigued by that. And it was an embarrassment of riches to be at Harvard at the time, because some of the foremost world experts on, workforce and employment and labor economics were all just right within reach. So I was having all these lunches with professors, and I think coming from a policy angle, I had like a dichotomy of two choices, right? So I could either go back to DC and take all the things that I've learned and work with a nonprofit and think about ways in which we impact, and tie education to workforce readiness, or I could work for a company. And those are the two choices at the time. For one reason or another, the working for companies didn't work out. But I became much more intrigued by a problem that I had faced as a direct care worker, right? And so the essential question being, and I will point this moment out to say that, to my earlier point, as a founder, if you're going to build something real or meaningful or true to yourself, and figure out and have the flexibility to build something that has traction and legs and is backable, you've got it. That takes a lot of space and time and being hungry after the problem, as opposed to the desire to build a company. I didn't have any desire at that point to build a company. It was more so, how do I posit this problem, or this opportunity rather, and where does it best live? And I thought it lived either in someone else's company. I thought maybe on Capitol Hill, but being at the iLab at the time really kind of changed my mindset. And I was working on a project around education and workforce with Boston Public Schools. And it was like the mini master's degree in a lot of the thinking and the product mindset and the project planning that went from that opportunity to what became CareAcademy. I took a lot of those learnings, and the day that I was set to get a promotion, I left Boston Public Schools to go work on CareAcademy. I worked odd jobs just to pay the rent, or sometimes barely, if ever, pay the rent. And I'll be always very honest about, my own experiences, in order to pursue, like, how do I think about this? How do I grow a company? And being a student of that, in order to build and develop this thesis that CareAcademy could create accessible classes and training that provided a stackable credential, and then launched careers into healthcare. That's a very beautiful and sexy thing to say, and but it takes a lot. It's building the technology, it's building the market traction before even the technology. And then also creating a paradigm shift because we don't currently, right now, there's no standard of what it means to be a direct care worker across the country. So we're in effect creating a new standard that doesn't exist. So I could talk on and on about that, but that's as much as I'll probably say.
No, that is great. I also want to shift over to and tease out a little bit more of you personally, and I say unveiling the hustle it takes to build a business. I mean, that not, you've raised just shy of $10 million, closed the Series A.
13 million.
13, oh, 13. Well, yeah, I meant just in the last round, 9.5, right. The raised well over, you talk about 13 million plus. And when you spoke about, you said, side jobs and hustle and trying to pay the rent, like sharing the real story in the background. So if you can share a little bit of for the aspiring founders and the investors that are looking at other founders to invest in, what's a moment when you if you can share a moment that you were like, I don't know if this is it, and what did you do? What helped you pull through that? So.
Yeah, so those moments never stop, right? And so there's a really great leadership book I'm reading right now. I read a ton of books, and you never stop learning, right? Like, I go into meetings now, and it took some time to build this muscle, but you go into meetings and go into conversations, even as you're hiring people, you're functionally as a founder and CEO, like, you're hiring people who are better at doing the job or whatever you've had to do. And I go in and admit my faults and my weaknesses and the things that I don't see and the things I need them to see on my behalf and the company's behalf. But I think if anything, I always call to, and this is something that's, I think, universal within foundership, is your narrative, to some extent. And for me, part of my narrative is about faith. And so I have a deep and abiding faith in God that has been strengthened by, my journey, and as a Christian woman. But narrative is a part of that, right? So reading stories of perseverance, and I think also a level of flexibility. So I talked earlier about being really married to the journey and learning, and having a just sort of faith in where I was sort of being led. And for me, I think a moment that I can speak to, I was on a bus. I lived in Somerville, Massachusetts at the time. And, I was in a place where, I'd emptied out my 401k, and I had, and a couple months before, I'd spoken to an angel investor who actually, even up to the most recent round, was a part of our round, where, I hadn't made the ask. I was just at this point showing sort of steady improvement. And I was on a week-to-week basis, we just get on a call, and I'd give her sort of where updates and where I was at and how I was thinking about things. And I wasn't expecting anything, but, we've been speaking, actually, this was during Mass Challenge. And I was on a bus, and I just felt like so exhausted, and I'm searching for a way to do a thing, right? By way of CareAcademy and how it's forming and how I'm thinking about it. And I just felt really exhausted by, it should look a certain way by now. I should be off to the races, right? Because you take in stories from other people about the overnight success, but when you dig a little deeper, it always takes longer. And I got this email from the founder at the time. I'm trying not to get choked up, because I hold these moments dear, but she wrote me an email that I've kept, and it was, I've seen how committed you are to this journey, and I don't, it was to the effect of like, I see how committed you are to this journey and what you're doing. I believe in what you're doing, and how you're changing and growing because of this journey. Here's the first $10,000, right, to build this. So an unsolicited first check from my first angel investor. And of course, I freaked out at the time, because I was like, oh my gosh, I've never seen this much money all at once. And like, my first angel investor checks, I knew I needed them. And I was too afraid to actually put them in the bank. And the two investors will probably laugh at hearing this now that we've taken on like $13 million. But I was terrified. I didn't put the checks in for like a month. And so one of the investors who had known me for a while took me out to Starbucks, and he's like, if you have to put it in the bank in order to like use the check. I've seen that you haven't used this check, so like, what's up? What's the problem? And so it was, I was dealing with so many things at once, right? Like, it's the faith in the journey and the belief of what this company still to this day like holds as its ethos and its centralizing like argument and the thing that it wants to build. And then also the development, by the way, for first-time founders and angel investors. I want that kind of discernment, as someday I hope to be an angel investor. I'm already in part, thinking and doing things as an angel investor to the extent that I can, having a level of discernment and seeing things in founders where they're committed to solving something and having the flexibility to reimagine that thing. But I was deeply appreciative of that. And then also being willing to share the story, right, of what we're trying to build, even if it didn't exist yet. And a lot of times, I mean, even to this day, I'm sharing a story of the impact that I hope this company has. It doesn't quite exist in full form or the way that I imagine it. But those are several pieces. I think, if anything, sort of narrative faith and flexibility, and an acknowledgement that if you're not growing with your startup, right, I could not imagine I cash checks all the time without a second look at them. Like, but I really struggled because it was this idea of, this money and what it doesn't mean and all those things. But I am very thankful that I've grown also in my sense of, the imperative of what we're building, and then also proof of what we're building can be very successful as well. So lots of different things there.
I appreciate you sharing that, Helen. That's it's a very real story. Like, a lot of founders are, like you said, they're hustling, they're passionate, and then when they get the money, they're like, okay, how do I spend it? Like, like they're protecting. They want to keep, squirrel all the nuts away to make sure that they survive the journey. So definitely a very real moment. So thank you for sharing that. Can you speak a little bit more into? You mentioned when we were briefing before the interview, the importance of owning your narrative and how the world sees your company. Can you share more on what it takes, especially as a founder of color, raising such a massive amount of money? What if you have any advice for those that are thinking about that journey? What are some things that you learned along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. I go back to that idea of narrative, and narrative as currency, right? We talk about, especially with all the finance folks who are, and this is no shade to finance folks or VCs, but we talk about comps, and we talk about multiples on EBITDA and all of these things, because I think that's the groundwork of us trying to rationalize value. But a really great salesperson, my dad, told me something, and that pricing and money are things that we rationalize after the fact, right? And so I say that to point back at what I mentioned earlier about the currency, the value of a narrative. Being able to hear stories and see other people who have stories like yours, it sustains us, even if we don't realize it or not. The story that you tell yourself sustains you through a long journey, and I have my own that has sustained me, and the ways in which I've been, blessed by grace. And also that will, in the rough times, sustain your team, right, of what you're trying to do in the world. And it's also your pitch deck, and the fact, and the multiples and the comps and the sexiness that we position are a story. They're all part of a story. The way in which you weave that story together, I don't care if you are Tim Cook or, Helen Adeosun, you have to be able to master this art of storytelling on behalf of stakeholders, right? That is the first, that is the last currency of building anything meaningful and being the head of a company. I realize that more and more and more as I become removed from the tactical pieces of CareAcademy. My job is much more on the strategy facing of CareAcademy, because that narrative dictates who we hire. That narrative dictates our strategy and how we win the market, right? And being able to tell that over and over again, and people to project themselves into it, and my investors being able to project that into themselves. That's part of hiring people, setting the strategy, and attracting an oversubscribed round into our Series A. While I was even with the people who had already committed to writing a check, including our lead investor during our fundraising, I had to be good about saying, hey, I realize this pandemic is happening. This could potentially undermine, because people are living in a state of fear right now about what this means for their companies. Sequoia, one of the most prolific investors in the Bay, and has predicted the last recession, is saying this is some like next level stuff. In the midst of that irrationality, there's a story taking shape for the people who've committed themselves to us in the midst of this round. This thing could, if I do not say anything right now, could completely tank. That story could undo the story that we began before the pandemic. So now, how do I intentionally, by grace, like reframe the story in our favor, right? It is the reframing of the fact that CareAcademy had essentially always had a thesis around changing healthcare, but now more than ever, we were reframing as the company that had to, there's a mandate because of this pandemic to grow the healthcare landscape. That story was told every single week to our customers because we had webinars. We were so sure about it that we said, we don't care if you're a customer, you're going to take a CareAcademy class on COVID. You need this right now, right? And at the back end, I was calling and talking to our investors who committed and saying, look, we have 80,000 people who just access this class in 2 months, right? We are needed more than ever. And so your investment dollars are not just about our, the growth trajectory we had before, but moving forward. And so so what we were talking about earlier is not only just even the narrative, the specificity of the words that are used, because we also in this moment, and since the murder of George Floyd, realize that there are inherent biases of living and breathing at intersectionality and being a Black or brown person, or an underestimated person, as Arlen Hamilton says, within this moment and context. So I believe, so there's work that America has to do, leaving America to do some of that work and helping and working alongside when I have the capacity and any others have the capacity. But for myself, for the vision that I've been given, for the mandate that I have to our stakeholders, right, to my customers, to the caregivers who trust us, and to our investors, because that is the role that I inhabit, how do I make sure that we are intentional about the way that our story is told? As a person who lives in intersectionality, you're going to have to it's the bull of the narrative that you're going to have to ride harder than I think, if I presented as a white man. I mean, we know this by virtue of not because Helen is saying it, but because of the numbers, the level at which Black women are seen as CEOs or invested in, right? It's like there's a 0.0, I don't even know what it is with the pandemic, but before the pandemic, it was 0.0006 or some very marginal, essentially zero, right? Percent in terms of receiving overall venture dollars in this country. I have to speak to why CareAcademy, why me, and how do we stick the landing? Because they're not investing in the fact that Helen is cute and nice and has a Harvard degree. It is the very fact that we believe that we're the company that will win in terms of the outlook in a very big and growing market. And more importantly, we will offer and can offer, because of that, a very sizable return, right? That's going to be the same before the pandemic and after the pandemic and everything else, right? It is offering sizable return. What is the market? How do you have the vision of growing out and expanding your opportunity and share of market and return? And so when I say CareAcademy because we're enabling the best part or the biggest part of healthcare, the people who offer healthcare services, we are a health tech company. And it's also the realization that because we are an ed tech intervention facing within healthcare, in the back of my mind, it's leveling up the importance of the people who do the work, the company that we are, and like, quite honestly, the potential in terms of multiple, right? In terms of exit. So it's intentional. So in telling your narrative and holding on to that, because if you're not telling it, someone else is telling it, I choose the conversations I'm a part of. I choose and have actually a script of words that I have anytime I'm talking about the company. I tell our board, and I get my board on the same page in terms of how they talk about the company, what we're doing, and who I am. So it's what I challenge for any founder, and especially for founders of color, is in the world that now I see that there's greater opportunity for founders of color and people who live in intersectionality. Be very intentional about the conversations you're a part of, and be very forthright about owning the narrative that you're currently in order to derive the best value for you, for yourself, because you live in a world, by definition of what bias is, that's not going to do that on your behalf, and it will actually counter good stories and good outcomes for you. So I'm very forthright about entering the conversations and changing the paradigm or the way questions are asked or what's said about me if I need to.
And on the topic of bias and institutional racism, and now that we're having more people recognize that the impact of that, what are some things in action that we can do and we can call people to do? And I'll specifically, there's a lot that can be done broader. I'm going to bring it into getting increasing the number of underrepresented founders, underrepresented investors in venture. Right. What needs to be done in there, in your opinion?
Yeah. I think it's the stories. I go back to the currency of narrative, right? I give people the mandate to not look broadly, right? I don't expect the Valley to figure out ways of, fixing or redeeming or reorienting police forces, because that's not the lake in the river you swim in, right? The river you swim in what you've been given is a place where you can examine, right, the what's happening there, right? And what I saw out of maybe the first couple of weeks since the murder of George Floyd was, and I think this is endemic. This is not sort of finger pointing and blaming, right? Because we're entrepreneurs. We're all entrepreneurial in spirit. For the folks hearing this, like, we're actually all part of the same. We're part of that tribe, and so I think the mandate is very similar here. So I'm putting myself as a part of that. But a reaction to go towards the status quo, right? And so you may have had folks in venture saying, "Oh, maybe it's like some level of office hours or different things." And I'm not saying those reactions were not born out of some level of good intention. I see that and I hear that and I recognize that. But I think it's more basic than that. I think let's revisit the story and why I'm reacting this way. But I think we're all part of this, or we're part of, and we're victims of the same culture that is about reaction. But the technologies that we take in breed reaction. So taking a moment to step back and saying, how are we feeding into sort of the status quo, and how we, as entrepreneurs and people who are entrepreneurial, we are set apart, right? So how do we take a deeper look at the systems that we've created, and what stories are we telling ourselves? What is the narrative that is undergirding my reaction in this way? And I think upon staying really local to the thing and the place that you inhabit and live, and challenging the narratives, the outcome of that, right? It's like product development. This is why I think like entrepreneurs are so best equipped to think about and reframe paradigms. It's product fit. If you went to market with assumptions that were predicated on what existed in the market, half the stuff and the companies that we exalt and we love and lionize wouldn't exist today, right? Because that's the status quo. Racism and bias is a status quo, and rather than affirming the status quo, right, or the story that founders who are live in marginality, it's because they lack something. Let's challenge the status quo, the narrative, or our own, predated narratives that because of the status quo of why do we feel that way and how can we better develop opportunities. So if I were thinking from a product development standpoint, you go to the customers, you go to the people, right? And so what I would love to see out of this moment is taking all of the best things and the inherent qualities that make entrepreneurial people great, is take the same paradigm. I'm not even asking you to do anything different. Take the same paradigm that you do in good product development and take that to the challenge of bias and racism, right? Go straight to the customers. It's not making the assumption based on the status quo and what currently exists. Develop out new products, right? Rather than office hours to teach people to do something, change that paradigm. What can I learn and how can I be best useful? Let me go to the customer and explore that, right? That's Eric Ries. That's not Helen Adeosun, right? So take the same frameworks that we lean upon and reorient them towards our own practices of bias. You wouldn't rely on the status quo in product development. Why would you do that in terms of addressing issues of systemic racism and bias?
Awesome. And on that note, I think that is a beautiful ending, Helen. So thank you, everyone, for everyone watching. This is Rebel One Live. Just heard from Helen Adeosun, who is CEO of CareAcademy. Thank you, Helen, for gracing us with your time. And thank you all for listening today.
Thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it.